On Radio 4 now, we join William Scanlon Murphy for the story of T.LOBSANG Rampa, Lama, mystic and plumber.
One spring morning in 1955, a strange figure strode into the London offices of publishers Secker and Warburg and demanded to see Mr. Frederick Warburg on urgent literary business. Despite the fact that he did not look particularly oriental, this portly, bald man wearing a saffron robe and sandals announced himself to be Dr. Tuesday Lobsang Rampa, a Tibetan Lama, known to his friends rather confusingly as Dr. Kuon. The bundle under his arm was the first installment of his amazing autobiography, The Third Eye, and he'd been told by the cosmic authorities that Secker and Warburg were karmically appropriate publishers. A rather baffled secretary showed the holy man straight into Mr. Warburg's office. The publisher looked on in fascination as Rampa produced a flashy document purporting to be a doctorate in medicine from the University of Chongqing. This had been thumped out on a cheap typewriter in badly spelled English, then festooned with objects bearing a remarkable similarity to bottle tops. The august Lama spoke excellent English with a rather fetching West Country accent. His manuscript read like a drastic rewrite of Lost Horizon. It described Rampa's boyhood in Lhasa, secret meetings with the Dalai Lama underneath his palace, philosophical discussions with yetis, and amazing scenes of looping round the Himalayas on man-carrying kites, punctuated with bursts of mysticism that read as though they might have dropped out of the Buddhist equivalent of a Christmas cracker. Many cosmic one-liners are swapped with Lobsang's guru and friend, Lama Mingyur Dondup. Most alarming of all was a stomach-wrenching account of a hole being bored in the 8-year-old Lobsang's forehead to open the amazing third eye, which allowed him to see people's mystic aura for various medical and paranormal purposes. The mildly obese, middle-aged, non-Oriental Devonian had no visible scars on his forehead, but he informed Mr. Warburg, after a brief inspection, that his aura was an especially good specimen. Smelling no rats whatsoever, the publisher was impressed by his visitor's transparent honesty and signed him up. One of the weirdest stories in publishing history had begun. Just before the book was published, Frederick Warburg had a last-minute attack of common sense and passed the manuscript to an expert on Tibet, who promptly fell about laughing. Several stiff drinks later, the expert suggested a simple test to establish the Tibetan credentials of the good doctor. At his next meeting with the author, Warburg solemnly lifted a piece of paper, screwed in his monocle, and carefully parroted the Tibetan for, "Did you have a nice journey, Mr. Rampa?" Several seconds passed. "It's Tibetan," said Mr. Warburg helpfully. Thud. Rampa fell screaming to the floor and began writhing in agony. When he had recovered, 2 full minutes later, he told Mr. Warburg that while he was a prisoner of the Japanese, he'd placed a hypnotic spell on himself to prevent him from speaking Tibetan so that he couldn't give away any secrets. To make really sure, he'd placed a similar block on speaking Chinese, Japanese, or indeed anything other than curiously rural English. Even hearing Tibetan spoken caused him torment, once he'd been told what it was, of course. This was obviously all perfectly true, so the shamefaced Mr. Warburg dropped his small-minded doubts about this persecuted saint and went ahead with publication. The Third Eye reduced most of the critics to appreciative jelly. The popular press simply raved. The most important book you will ever read, and One in the Eye for Christianity, were 2 of the less hysterical comments, along with the ever-popular, "This book will change your life." There were dissenters among the cheerleaders. Guy Wint, in the Manchester Guardian, said that the whole thing seemed rather fishy. On the other hand, the Times declared itself moved by the nobility of the ethical system which produces such beliefs in such men as the author. Rampa made £20,000 in a single year, a vast amount in 1955. The book went to the top of the bestseller lists in 12 countries. The age of Rampa had dawned. However, one review was a little more searching. The Daily Telegraph went to the unheard-of trouble of hiring a critic who knew what he was talking about. Old Tibet hand Hugh Richardson growled, "Anyone who has lived in Tibet will feel after reading a few pages that its author is certainly not a Tibetan." Several grizzled heads in university Oriental departments nodded in outraged agreement. Before long, one unkind soul went so far as to hire a private detective to investigate the Lama's bona fides. Rampa tossed off another bestseller, Doctor from Lhasa, which told how the Dalai Lama and Lama Mingyur Dondup had sent him on a secret mission that resulted in amazing wartime adventures in the Chinese Air Force. Meanwhile, however, the private investigator had turned in his report. Tuesday Lobsang Rampa was in fact one Cyril Henry Hoskins, a plumber from Plympton. Not only had he never been to Tibet, he'd never been on so much as a day trip to Calais. The one great move in his life had been from Plympton to Thames Ditton, where he baffled his customers by dressing up in Lama's robes and telling them to call him first Karl Kwon Suo, then Lobsang Rampa. His wife also got into the spirit of things and slowly metamorphosed from Sarah Hoskins into Mama San Raab Rampa. Rampa wound up as a clerk in a correspondence college in Weybridge, where he didn't actually have to meet the customers, but even this gave way under his sheer weight of weirdness. Rather prosaically, the composition of the third eye coincided exactly with his sudden confrontation with unemployment. End of story? Not even the beginning. When confronted with these dreary allegations, Rampa smiled at his critics and thrashed out another book, The Rampa Story, explaining the situation. These were the facts. On the 13th of June, 1949, Cyril Hoskins, plumber and much misunderstood mystic, climbed into a tree to photograph an owl. Unfortunately, his weight proved too much for one of the branches, and down he came, head first, sending his terrified cat scurrying for cover. Meanwhile, Tuesday Lobsang Rampa, a real honest-to-goodness Lama, was cruising by on the astral plane. Rampa had hit a bad patch back in Tibet. His body was coming to bits after a hard life of man-carrying kites, Japanese torturers, and assorted metaphysical fender-benders. He was in the market for a new model. Meanwhile, Hoskins was sick of his meaningless, materialistic Western existence. He needed Thames Ditton like he needed a hole in the head, which, of course, is exactly what Rampa had, so the two fell into conversation. They both nipped across to Tibet, via the astral plane, of course, so that Lobsang's abbot and the ever-present Lama Mingyo Donda could act as brokers. Before long, a deal had been struck. Rampa negotiated a huge karmic discount for Hoskins, for which Hoskins would trade in his bodily shell. Rampa would get Hoskins' body, not to mention his wife, cat, and colossal overdraft, while Hoskins would simply drift off into nirvana. And so was born the Lama with the Devon accent. We must assume that the Chinese certificate with the bottle tops was posted on by Lama Dondup. By any standards, the Rampa story was one of the most bizarre books ever published in Britain, but it achieved its object, to dig Rampa out of the credibility gap he'd fallen into. Critics could still call him a fraud, and they did. But now it would have to be a different kind of fraud, and one that was virtually impossible to prove. He wasn't just some sort of illegal immigrant. 20 years ahead of his time, he was what the New Age people now call a walk-in, the proud new tenant of a pre-owned body. The Rampa story sold by the lorry load to millions of believers all over the world. After the Rampa story came the Cave of the Ancients, more of Lobsang's early pre-Hoskins adventures in Tibet. But it's the fourth Rampa book that really separates the true believers from the cosmic snackers. It is the autobiography of Lobsang Rampa's cat, as told to Rampa. The title page proudly proclaims the book to be by Mrs. Fifi Grey Whiskers, PSC, that's Pedigree Siamese Cat, by the way, translated from the Siamese cat language by T.LOBSANG Rampa. It tells the heart-rending tale of Fifi's selfless sharing of Rampa's sorrows as he is forced to plod from an Irish tax exile to a Canadian one, with the cynical devils of the unbelieving press snapping at his heels. Soon after Living with the Lama was published, a journalist turned up unannounced at Rampa's Canadian hideaway to interview him about the true authorship of Living with the Lama. He was repelled with an ear-splitting curse shrieked from an upstairs window. Rampa cursing journalists was nothing new, but there are 2 points of interest here. One is that the curse was supposedly in Tibetan, so either both men should have keeled over, or Lobsang's anti-difficult languages spell had worn off. The other is that the following week the journalist was the sole survivor in an air crash. Every one of Rampa's books from the Rampa story onwards contains a tirade against the press. He thought they were out to get him, and from time to time he was quite right. Occasionally they did downright embarrassing things, such as asking the Dalai Lama and his staff for their opinion of Rampa. The answer boiled down to the baffled inquiry, who? For his many fans who thirsted for practical advice, Rampa wrote You Forever, which he described as a very special course of instruction for those who are sincerely interested in knowing the things which have to be known. Astral travel, auras, trances, telepathy, time travel, they're all here in a handy DIY guide. There's also a useful chapter on how to stop smoking. It's particularly important, says Lobsang, to establish the right atmosphere and light levels in the room to be used as your base of astral operations. For those with inadequate technical knowledge, there's an extremely helpful full-page drawing of a light bulb. 2 vital pieces of mystical kit were made available for the more determined student. Dr. Rampa's tranquilizer touchstones, cosmically aligned lumps of soapstone at a very untranquilizing price, and a record at a downright karmic price of Lobsang himself intoning meditation mantras. These include his inspiring Devonian rendition of that old favourite, "All life is a circle, Om." The casual listener might wonder who's been putting what in the Wurzel's scrumpy. Whatever else Rampa may have been, he was an uncanny prophet of the New Age fads of the 80s and 90s. Not only was he the first walk-in, he may well have been the first UFO abductee. My Visit to Venus, a collection of outtakes from Rampa's earlier works, is by far the rarest of his books for the intriguing reason that he himself tried to suppress it. It tells how he, Lama Dundup, and 5 colleagues climbed up to a plateau in Tibet known only as the Hidden Land, just after the last war. Here they toured the ruins of the ancient city of the gods, and were treated to a fascinating lecture on the past and future history of Tibet aboard a flying saucer that they found parked there. Earth, apparently, was originally a Venusian colony that had to be evacuated when disease broke out and turned everyone into humans. The tragedy still in effect, unfortunately. After this depressing little pep talk, 2 Venusians with the awesome names of the Tall One and the Broad One appeared with a cheerful cry of "Fear not, brothers," and flew Rampa and his friends to Venus. Venus is, of course, a highly advanced, peace-loving planet where everyone drives a hover car and speaks fractured Hollywood biblical epic English. Why did Rampa try to ban My Visit to Venus? The answer is, of course, ludicrously obvious. Even he thought he'd gone too far this time. But this is the only evidence of his ever having doubted himself or his story. Every Rampa book contains the statement, "My books are true," in block capitals and furious denunciations of anyone who thinks otherwise. But did Rampa believe his own story, or was he a straightforward con man? The fact is that he was astonishingly slipshod at keeping up Tibetan appearances. There are long passages in his books moaning about income tax, rude waiters, or the service in Canadian shops, where it's difficult not to imagine some old boar on a bar stool on Monty Python's Yorkshireman, rather than a Tibetan monk holding forth on the decline of the West. A true fraudster would have tried harder. The chances are that he wouldn't have tried putting out books by his cat either. Whether or not Cyril Lobsang Rampa Hoskins believed the Rampa tale himself, it's quite certain that hundreds of thousands of readers believed every word of it. And the more Rampa was exposed as a fraud, the more they believed him. He's now been taken up on a huge scale by the California-based New Age industry, with new pseudo-scholarly editions of his books dropping off the presses every month. In California, land of the channeler and the inner child, Rampa is among friends. He's now more widely believed than ever. After all, in a country boasting a church of nuclear power and a middle-aged housewife who proclaims herself the Archangel Uriel and counts her followers in thousands, Rampa is not even particularly outrageous. Unfortunately, Lobsang Rampa is no longer around to welcome all these new readers. He died a Canadian citizen in Alberta in 1981 after 10 years in a wheelchair, on the same day, strangely enough, as the Dalai Lama's mother, a coincidence which offered what may be a tiny clue to what had really gone on in the mind of Cyril Hoskins, leafing through his Oriental book collection one freezing, friendless, unemployed day in 1955. The Dalai Lama's real name, according to his mother's obituary, is Lama Dundup. His older brother's name is Lobsang. In the end, Johnny Weissmuller thought he really was Tarzan. The chances are that Lobsang Rampa thought he was Lobsang Rampa. Maybe Cyril Hoskins thought so too.